Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, and normally I refer to myself as the Game Master, but Jay Mora was the GM for this one. And in fact, this was actually the last game he ever ran before the baton got handed off to me to take over. Um, Jay had been our GM all through our high school years. Um, I guess I'll start off by saying that the games that Jay ran were my favorite games of all time. I think that a lot of the ideas that Jay had were some of the best ideas we ever had in the game. So um, I can't possibly give him enough credit, for all of this. So what was happening in this game though was affected by what was happening out of game. And I'm going to briefly talk about that to kind of just set things up to give sort of a richer understanding of kind of the situation with the characters. So we've got three main characters at this point, which are Powerhouse, who used to be Superboy, and Doctor Strange cast a spell and he forgot he ever was Superboy. He's going to be Superboy again. We're just not quite there yet. So right now he's going by the name Powerhouse because after the death of Superman, now there's another Superboy who's a clone running around. At any rate, the second character is Shadowstorm, who by the way is who I'm depicting in the channel art for this video. Shadowstorm was played by Jay. He was Jay's GMPC. And then the third hero was Torch, and who had like fire powers and super speed and stuff like that. And he was played by Ryan Miller. And so, what was going on in real life is that at my high school, it was very, very, very common. We were actually kind of famous for it, if I'm being really honest. It was very common for all the kids to drink on the weekends. That on Friday or Saturday night, there'd be a big party somewhere every weekend. And so one of the guys at my school, I guess I won't mention him by name, his dad was actually a teacher. And so the dad's thing was he had seen so many students over the years fall victim to things like drinking and driving, right? And so his attitude was there's no way I'm going to get them to not drink. But what I can do is let them have the parties at my house and take their keys, right? So that was his attitude. And his son was a friend of mine. And so I was going over there quite a bit on the weekends. And Jay and Ryan were going over there for sure. And at any rate, I think out of all of us, I think Ryan was the first one to drink. And that might have been at the beginning of high school, but I'm not sure. And then I was the second, where for me it was about the midway point, I think, of high school. And then Jay, I think, was the last. I think because he joined the army out after high school, and then I think he started drinking in the army, and he would drink Jack Daniels. Me and Ryan were drinking Natural Light. That's high school kids don't have a whole lot of money, so that was the cheapest beer at the time. That was the sort of the official beer of these parties. And so a couple of things happened there that are worth noting. I'll start with Ryan. I don't know what had happened when we were younger, but Ryan was at one point the most popular kid in school. And I have no idea what happened, but he went from that to being the least popular kid in school, where the other popular kids kind of exiled him in a way. And so then when we were freshmen, it it seemed like Ryan didn't have any friends at all. And then he and I were on the basketball team together, and we struck up a conversation one day, and it kind of snowballed into us being friends. Me and Jay were already friends, so Ryan kind of joined our group, you know. But I think that that early friendship was kind of based on a lack of popularity, right? And as the years went on, Ryan started kind of climbing that social ladder again. And by the end of high school, he was very popular. And I don't want to frame this like he didn't need us anymore or something like that, because I don't want to insult the man. I still have, you know, he has a place in my heart. He was a really good friend. He was the best man at my wedding, actually. But I think that, you know, I think that as he made new friends, I think maybe kind of like holding on to the past just wasn't as much of a priority for him, maybe. I mean, I don't know. We've never really talked about it. I ran into him once at a high school reunion, and I asked him kind of what happened. And I can't remember now how he worded it, but he said something along the lines of, he's like, "Have you ever wanted a little space?" And I was like, "No, or not really, no." Um, and I was just like, "I don't know, man. That seems different than sort of just never talking to someone again." And he just seemed not that thrilled to be around me, you know? So at any rate, um, so during high school, you know, Ryan was wanting to hang out with us less and less as time went on. Ryan was playing the game less and less. Um, and then for me personally, I think the moment where things changed for me really was when I started drinking. Because as it turns out, you know, the other kids at my school were they didn't like me because back then, if you read comic books or if you played Dungeons& and Dragons, they hated you. Oh my gosh, like, that was just, they could not tolerate that one bit, and, so when we started drinking, though, I'm a big guy, like, I was on the football team and stuff like that, and so it turns out I could actually pretty much drink everybody else under the table, and it got to be kind of a stupid party trick, is, like, they would get me my own, you know, case of beer or whatever, and I would sit there and I would drink them all in the course of the night and not even be buzzed. I would feel fine, you know, and just the other kids thought that was so cool that I started to get kinda popular for the first time ever. So that was going on. And then on Jay's end, I think the deal with Jay was he had some bad stuff happen in his past that even though I was his best friend, he never told me about it. The guy who owned our comic book store, he had kind of read about some stuff in the newspaper involving Jay's parents. I'll leave it at that. I don't want to get into details. And then he told me about it years later. Um, and so I know Jay was going through a lot. I know Jay had a hard childhood. I kind of wonder if it was like a popularity thing because the reason Jay was unpopular at our school, aside from stuff like playing Dungeons and Dragons and reading comic books and things like that, was back then. I lived in the middle of nowhere, and this was decades ago, right? And like where I lived, people were very racist. And Jay was the only kid. He had just moved to our school. He was the only kid who was not white. So there were a lot of other kids that were really, really, really crappy to Jay and running their mouth and saying stuff that was uncool. And I think maybe part of it was now I was at a party with those guys. You know what I mean? Even if I wasn't talking to them, I think it was the fact that I I didn't like being unpopular or whatever. You know what I mean? Like everybody wants acceptance, I think. So so there's that. And then the reason I mentioned Jay's past is, and I don't know this for sure. This is just a guess, so I want to be very clear. I assume Jay knew somebody who drank too much just based on the way he was acting around me and Ryan when we drank, where he was like really uncool about it. And he was not the guy who would tell you how he was feeling or what was bothering him. You know what I mean? Um, so yeah, to this day, I don't quite know, but it seems like even if it was just me and Jay and Ryan hanging out, and me and Ryan drank a couple beers, like Jay was not happy. And at the time, and sort of like we didn't really know how the world worked yet, right? So if that was like a trigger or something for Jay, like we would not have known that word back then. We wouldn't really have, I don't think, understood the concept. So so by the time high school was wrapping up, out of game, we were not getting along so well, right? And it kind of came to a head. I think there was a New Year's Eve party or senior year, and I think that was kind of the breaking point. And then after that, I actually remember hearing from some other guys that there were some people who um they were actually placing bets. They thought me and Jay were gonna come to blows at one point and get in a fist fight. They were placing bets on who they thought would win. And they knew I was stronger, but they knew Jay was faster, and you know what I mean? So that's kind of how bad things were going. But despite all that, like Jay and I were still playing the role playing game. And Jay, he was still running an adventure at least once a week at that point. Um, and then, but we weren't doing anything other than that. You know, we had been going to the movies or the arcade or, you know, whatever. What was that one cable show with Rhonda Shear? We used to watch that all the time. Jay had cable and I didn't have cable where I lived. But at any rate, we used to do more stuff other than role playing games. And there at the end, all we did was the role playing game. And and so Jay told us at one point he'd enlisted in the army. And we graduated at the end of May in 1994. And then in I think it was in mid-June is when he shipped out for boot camp. So between those two dates, he said, you know, I'm going to run one last game and that's going to be it. This was it. And so the premise was supposed to be that the three heroes I mentioned earlier, our characters, were going to go on a European vacation. And for me personally, I don't know about anybody else, but for me, I kept thinking of the Chevy Chase movie by the same name, right? And imagining kind of hijinks and going all sorts of places around Europe and, you know, da 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 da. I kind of imagined it as being bigger than it was in a way. And instead, what it was is um, our characters, first of all, Ryan didn't even show up. And that was a bummer. I think me and Jay were both like really sad. And he didn't like give us a phone call or anything. But yeah, he just didn't show up. And so it was just me and Jay. It was a solo adventure. And so then the premise was that Powerhouse and Shadowstorm then go to Europe. And Jay introduced the idea that Powerhouse by now owned an Apache helicopter because Jay loved Apache helicopters. And I remember thinking that was weird because there was no lead up to it. There was no element in the story where it explained why he had one. And I think that was kind of the beginning of Jay maybe kind of just not caring about the game anymore. You know, he was it's like when you have a job and it's like your last day of work, you're probably not doing your best. You know what I mean? I think it was maybe a little like that. Just the helicopter part, the rest was fine. And so, my character, like, cause out of game, I had the biggest crush on Samantha Fox. And so I remember in game, I was like, I want to go to her house and like get an autograph or something like that. And so my character goes to her house, and of course they won't let him in, and that's completely understandable. And she had some kind of thing at the gate or whatever that you could buy. And so he got a poster, I think for free, actually. But it was supposed to be a poster of hers that was actually signed by hers. And so that was his souvenir. And he goes and he puts it in the helicopter. And then they split up. And I think Jay's thing was like, I this is an adventure for you. This is a solo adventure, and you don't get your friends to help you, kind of thing. And so they split up. And so my character starts sightseeing. And to get to the point, he eventually arrives at a castle, and it's in Ireland. I want to say it's in Southern Ireland. And at any rate, he goes into the castle, and it's kind of weird. It's got like a creepy vibe, kind of like a haunted house kind of a vibe, where most, like, if you weren't a adventurer in a role-playing game, you probably didn't have the guts to enter the castle. Is that kind of thing. So it wasn't like a tourist trap or something. So he goes in this old castle, and it's dark and so on and so forth, and he starts looking around, and it starts to feel very Dungeons and Dragons, honestly. Not that there were monsters, but just the way Jay was describing it and stuff. And the first game Jay ever ran for me was a Dungeons and Dragons game, I think. So I suspect that was kind of nostalgic for Jay in a way, that if he started with exploring a castle, then he was going to end with exploring a castle, like it was poetic. So at any rate, my character, I remember there's kind of a T shape area, and he goes over to the left, and then he goes up, and he enters this this room called the Sanctuary. And inside of this is this demon, like a massive demon. And so this is sort of like the boss, to use video game terminology. This is like the level boss, right? In fact, from Jay's point of view, this is actually the boss for the entire game he ran. Um, so there's this like massive demon in here, and it picks up one of the pews in the sanctuary and like throws it at my guy. And my guy has been leveling up all through high school. And at one point, we were literally playing like multiple times a day, every day. So my guy had gotten to be pretty tough, right? But um but the demon was, tougher. And so they just slug it out. And there's really not much in the way of story, unfortunately. But they fight, and the good guy wins. And the demon then kind of, how would I describe it? Like, he kind of sizzles away. Like, he's defeated. I guess it would be like in certain video games where you beat a character in a video game and they kind of, I don't know if disintegrate is the word I want to use or what. Hopefully you get the basic gist. So he's sort of like red smoke and stuff, and he leaves, and then the vibe in the castle changes. So the reason it seemed like a haunted house or whatever was because this thing was in here. And then the sanctuary had issues from it being in there. And at any rate, though, so the sanctuary is like a really long room, and you enter, like, if you're looking up front, like where a preacher or something would be, there there would be a door behind you in the center of that wall that you walked in through, right? And then at the front, like behind the preacher, there's a secret door, up there on that wall. You had to do like a search check basically to find it. So my guy goes through here, and then this room becomes very notorious in our game. And it is an all stone room, and the ceiling is shaped like a dome, and it is stained glass. And in this, it's how do I want to describe it? There is like a sunk in stone carved pit kind of thing in the center. And then in the center of that pit is like a square pedestal. And atop the pedestal is a Celtic cross. And I thought that was really interesting because Jay was not like a Christian or anything like that. I think he was looking for symbolism that he associated with Ireland and stuff like that. You know what I mean? But so there's this cross here, and the glass ceiling has been damaged over the years. So every time it rains, this pit has filled up with water, kind of like a swimming pool, basically, right? And so at any rate, if I remember correctly, he says that when my character enters the room, he loses his powers. He feels like he's just a human again. And again, like I said before, Jay kind of started out with D&D, so in his mind he was ending with castles and you know what I mean, stuff like that. Well, so as my character at the beginning of everything seemed very human and stuff like that, that is now how he felt again. He'd kind of like come full circle. And at any rate, he is trying to make his way to this cross thing in the middle of the pool, and when he enters the pool, something really interesting happens, which is we had said in a previous video that at one point this character who used to be Superboy and who will be Superboy again, right? He had been assimilated. He had been taken into the future, and he was assimilated, and they had injected him with these nanoscopic robots, and all of the cells of his body had been like covered in this stuff that I would compare to liquid metal. And as a hero, he's had this body of metal now for a really long time, in terms of that chapter, our high school years. It was the majority of our high school years he had that metallic look. And so when he goes into the water, it turns out Celtic Cross has a slot in the top where Excalibur goes. Um, and so what Jay had ruled was the sword put off what is basically like holy energy, right? And so it had sort of had an effect on the water. And so the water in this room that we call the sword room, it glowed blue. And so there's no lights or anything in here. The water itself is the light source. And so when Powerhouse goes into the water, he sort of separates. And I was always reminded of there's the scene in the one Superman movie where there's a fight between like Superman and Clark Kent in a junkyard where he had been corrupted, right? And then this fight scene was all part of his purification process, basically. And so this basically Jay did the exact same thing. And the metal portion of him, right, which now thinks of itself as Powerhouse, it beats down the guy, right, the graduate, and it'll like really almost kills him. And then the powerhouse symbiote flies away. It flies up through the stained glass, breaking it. So it rains glass. And so then my characters is laying here like, what am I going to do now? And it turns out that the water has healing properties. So he gets all of his hit points back and he gets out of the water. Um, and what it is, how do I want to put this? The metal body had been holding him back, right? His cells could not absorb yellow sun radiation as long as, because you could almost look at that metal persona almost like a court. You know what I mean? So now he was uncorked. Now he could finally realize his potential and so on and so forth. And that's it. And then that was the last of the game. And I think Jay wanted there to be a big change in the status quo, because then the Jay years were remembered as kind of that the metallic look of the character, that I think is what a lot of people think of when they think of Jay's tenure, as the GM. After that, the metal portion, by the way, goes back to America, calls itself Powerhouse, is honestly acting a lot like the Eradicator from the Superman comics, where it's killing criminals and being a little more ruthless than he was when he had kind of a human soul to kind of resist some of those urges, you know what I mean? And of course, the whole point of the symbiote was that it was made by a bad guy, right? The goal was to turn my character into a bad guy. So without my character and his willpower, for instance, being part of that whole equation, then yeah, then that became more of a bad guy. And then my guy, of course, gets back to America and has all new adventures then, um, which sort of coincided with me starting college. I took over the game. I met new people in college I never met before, made a bunch of friends, a lot of whom are still my friends, still play the game. You know what I mean? And then they were hearing from my character kind of what Jay had ran and stuff like that. But at any rate, yeah, so I care a lot about this adventure. To say I enjoyed it was a is an understatement. I really enjoyed this adventure. Um, it I can't help but, like, I don't only think of it as what was going on in game, right? I think of it the out of game stuff. I think about friends I had in high school and, you know, all that jazz. So at any rate, I hope that you enjoyed hearing about this one. If so, as always, you know the drill. Hit like, make sure you're subscribed, leave us a comment. And from everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.